She's staying for Christmas?
Mom invited her. What did you find?
Something I needed to see.
Nora, what is this?
The truth you never asked about.
The night James Brine announced his separation at his firm's year-end dinner, he said his wife's name exactly once, as if correcting a typo, then turned to the woman beside him and smiled. Across the room, a man from Whitfield Capital's legal team set down his glass. He recognized the woman James had just dismissed. He said nothing because she had asked him not to. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and Shawshank twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. But that evening was not where the story began. It began 3 years earlier, in a city built on ambition, in a marriage that quietly ran on something else entirely. Nora Whitfield had grown up watching money do things to people. It straightened their backs at the wrong moments. It made them calculate before they felt. Her father, Elliot Whitfield, had built Whitfield Capital Group from a regional property fund into something that reached across 9 states, and the whole time he had watched the same thing happen to people around him. Anyone can handle a little money, he used to say. The question is what they do with a lot of it, and you can't know that until they have it. So Elliot had given Nora a different kind of preparation. She trained as an antique appraiser. She learned to walk through wealthy homes and say nothing that revealed how much she understood. She lived in a modest apartment in Midtown. She drove a 6-year-old car and bought her coffee from the shop on the corner that was always half empty. And when people asked about her family, she said her father was in real estate and left it there. She was not performing poverty. She was waiting to find out who she was when none of it was on the table. She met James at a gallery opening she'd been hired to consult for. She was there to evaluate 3 pieces the host was considering insuring. James was there because a client had given him 2 tickets he couldn't resell. He was tall and restless, and had a way of listening that made her feel heard before she had said anything important. He asked her what she did. She told him. He didn't ask a single question about money. He asked where she had learned to read old things, and she told him about her grandmother's house in Virginia, where every drawer held something from a different decade, and he laughed and said he had always wanted that kind of house. Not the expensive kind, just the kind with history in it. She gave him her number. They were engaged 11 months later. James was ambitious. She knew that from the beginning and didn't mind it. Ambition, she had decided, was only a problem when it was the only thing. He was also funny and genuinely curious and better with people than she was. And he loved her steadily in the way she had hoped she would recognize when she found it. She didn't tell him about Whitfield Capital. Her father was still alive when they married, and the timing had never felt right. By the time Elliot's health began to fail, the not telling had become its own kind of shape in the room, familiar enough that breaking it felt larger than it was. She kept meaning to find the moment. There were always other moments pressing in ahead of it. James had his own ambitions pressing in. Crane Belmont Partners was growing, and James was growing with it, and she could feel the way his attention shifted when the stakes got higher. It wasn't that he stopped caring about her, it was that he stopped noticing her. There is a difference, and it takes a while to understand it matters. The call from Aaron Park came on a Thursday evening, when they were supposed to go to dinner with friends. Nora stepped into the hallway to take it. Elliot Whitfield had passed that afternoon at the hospital, where Nora had sat with him 3 days running. Aaron was very professional about it. He told her the trust documentation was ready, and the timeline for transfer of control. She thanked him. She stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she went back into the kitchen and told James they would need to skip dinner. "Everything okay?" he asked. "My father passed," she said. He put his arms around her and held her, and it was genuine. It was. She would not let herself forget that, but he did not ask about the call she had taken first. He did not ask who had been on the phone before she told him. He asked about the funeral and whether she needed to fly out and whether there was anything he could do. All the right questions. Just not the one she had been quietly waiting for someone to ask. She drove home from the funeral 6 days later and found James at the kitchen table, with maps spread across it, property maps, zoning records, a development plan. He rolled them up when she came in. "Sorry," he said. "Work, it's fine," she said, and she put the kettle on. And she started, very quietly, to pay attention. 3 weeks after Elliot Whitfield's funeral, Nora sat alone in Aaron Park's conference room on the 41st floor of a building she'd been to exactly twice. Aaron had laid the trust documents out in order, each tab flagged in blue. He went through them slowly and asked if she had questions at every section. She had none. She had been reading trust documents since she was old enough to understand them. Elliot had made sure of that. The number on the summary page was $4 billion in managed assets across 9 states. She looked at it for a moment, then she initialed the page and moved to the next one. Aaron walked her to the elevator when they were done. He said her father had been very clear about her timeline and her choices, and that there was no pressure to change anything about how she was living. She could take, as long as she needed to decide how she wanted to approach the trustee role publicly. "Most people take 6 to 12 months, he said. "Your father expected it might be longer. I'll let you know," she said. In the car on the way home, she held her wallet in her lap. Aaron's business card was tucked behind everything else, her grocery store loyalty card, her library card, her insurance card. She thought about that for a long time. Then she moved it to the front. James was on the phone when she got home. He raised a hand in greeting and turned toward the window. She could hear the specific cadence of his voice that meant he was talking to senior partners. Tighter, more formal, the version of himself he deployed when he needed to look capable of more than he had yet been given. She made dinner. He came off the call 20 minutes later and sat down and was almost present. "Sorry," he said. "Summit Row thing." "What's Summit Row?" He explained it the way he explained most of his work, assuming her interest but not her understanding. "A mixed-use development in Buckhead, Atlanta's most competitive commercial corridor. 3 parcels their firm needed development rights to. They had been working the negotiation for over a year. The problem is Whitfield Capital won't move," he said, and she watched him say the name without registering it. "Some private holding company. We can't even get a meeting with anyone who can make a real decision." "Who owns it?" she said. "Nobody knows. It's a trust, some old family thing." He shook his head. "The management layer is professional, but the actual authority sits somewhere above that, and nobody will tell us who." "That sounds frustrating," she said. "It's a $100 million deal, Nora. It's more than frustrating." He looked at her. "I'm sorry. I'm still on the call in my head." She said it was fine. She passed him the salt. He picked up his phone. The spring came, and the distance between them grew the way distance usually does. Not in one event, but in accumulating smaller ones. He stopped asking about her appraisal work. He started having dinner meetings 2 or 3 nights a week. He came home late with the particular tidiness of someone who had been around people or who noticed his appearance. She did not accuse him. She did not ask. She watched the way someone watches a thing she is not yet ready to name. A woman named Audra Layton began appearing in his stories about work. Always incidentally, or always with a specific kind of care that meant she was not incidental at all. Audra had consulted for the Crane Belmont presentation. Audra had made an introduction that saved the Summit Row timeline. Audra knew how to talk to the Layton people, who were connected to everything in the commercial real estate world. Nora looked up Douglas Layton one afternoon between appointments. His firm held a portfolio of hospitality properties across the Southeast. His daughter was a wealth management consultant. She was exactly what James would describe as well connected. Nora did not bring this up at dinner. What she did instead was start paying attention to a different set of details. The way James said Whitfield Capital with a specific edge of frustration, not the way he talked about bureaucratic obstacles, but the way he talked about things he believed should already be his. The way he rolled up his development maps when she came into a room. The way he talked about the Summit Row deal as if it were a matter of when, not if, even though the key permissions had been stalled for 18 months. She was an antique appraiser. She knew the difference between something that had merely aged and something that had been quietly maintained. The Whitfield properties had been maintained. Someone was keeping them intact. She knew who. She had known since Aaron laid the trust summary on the table 3 weeks ago. What she was figuring out now was why her husband had never thought to ask her. Aaron's card sat at the front of her wallet. She had not used it yet, but she left it there because she had learned from her father that the moment you need something tends to arrive before you feel ready for it. Better to know where it was. She cleared the dinner plates. James was already back on his phone. The Crane Belmont Midsummer Dinner was held at a restaurant in Buckhead that cost more per person than Nora charged for a full appraisal. It was the kind of place where the lighting was designed to make everyone look like they belonged there. James had told her it was a client appreciation event. He had mentioned it the night before, not the week before, and had said she was welcome to come if she wanted. The room held about 40 people. James introduced her to 3 colleagues, a pair of developers from Nashville, and a woman from a commercial lender, who talked to her about kitchen renovations for 11 minutes before being called away. Nora was used to this. She had been walking through rooms like this her whole adult life. Rooms where the assumption was that she was there as someone's spouse, not as someone in her own right. She had learned to be patient with it. She was standing near the bar when 2 men from the far table crossed the room in her direction. She recognized them by their badges before their faces, Whitfield Capital Group in small gray letters. They were senior members of the firm's legal advisory team. She had met both of them at Elliott's estate review 14 months ago. The first one, a man named Gerald Price, stopped when he saw her. His expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible. Almost. She met his eyes and gave a very small shake of her head. He stopped completely. Then he extended his hand and said, "Mrs. Brine, lovely to see you, Mr. Price," she said. "This is my husband, James." James looked between them. "You two know each other?" "We've met once or twice," Price said carefully. Through a mutual contact, he shook James's hand. "I've heard excellent things about the work Crane Belmont has been doing." James lit up. He spent the next 10 minutes telling Price about Summit Row. Price listened with the polite attentiveness of a man who already knew everything James was describing. Nora watched her husband's hands move, and she thought, he cannot see it. He is talking to a man who works for the entity that has been blocking him for 18 months, and he cannot see it. Price said nothing about Whitfield Capital. He said it was a fascinating project. He excused himself. James watched him go. "How do you know that guy?" "An estate appraisal," Nora said. "A few years back. He seemed like someone important." "He is," she said. James looked at her for a moment, and she could see him doing the calculation, wondering if there was something there he could use, and then deciding she probably didn't know enough about it to be useful. He moved on to talk to a developer from Nashville. Audra Layton arrived 40 minutes into the event. She was tall and moved through the room with the ease of someone who had been raised to believe that any room she entered had been waiting for her. James spotted her from across the floor, and his posture changed, not dramatically, but Nora noticed. She had been noticing small things for months. Audra was warm when James introduced them. She had a firm handshake and an easy laugh, and she asked Nora what she did with the specific kind of polite inquiry that means nothing. Nora told her. Audra said, "That's wonderful," in the voice people use when they consider something charming but limited. Later in the evening, Nora stepped out to the terrace for air. Through the glass, she could see James and Audra standing near the bar. They were not touching. But their distance from each other was the distance of people who had already been closer and were performing professional restraint. She heard them through the door she had not fully closed. "Summit Row needs that Whitfield property," Audra was saying. "There has to be a way to move them. If we can figure out who actually holds the trust authority, we can apply pressure at the right level." "James, our team has been trying that for over a year. Your team hasn't had the right access. My father's people know that market. Let me make some calls." "What kind of calls?" "The kind that get to the right person." A pause. "There's always a pressure point. In a trust like this, there's always someone who needs liquidity or wants to simplify their obligations. You just have to find them." Nora stood on the terrace with her hands very still on the railing. She was the trust. She was the pressure point. She was the person they were planning to find. And she was 40 feet away, holding a glass of sparkling water that she had barely touched, listening to her husband agree that yes, A pressure point would be exactly the right approach. She waited until James came to find her. "Having a good time?" he asked. "I got some air," she said. It was warm inside. On the drive home, she looked out the passenger window at the city lights and thought about what pressure point meant and what it would cost the person applying it once they realized who she was. James talked about the dinner the whole way home. He said Audra had great instincts and real connections. He said Summit Row was going to come together. Nora said she was glad to hear it. That night, she sent Aaron Park a message. "Are you available this week?" His reply came in 4 minutes. "Tuesday at 2. I'll clear the afternoon." Camille Bryne's house in Buckhead was the kind of house that announced its own importance from the street. Tall white columns, a circular drive, carefully curated landscaping that cost more to maintain than most people earned. Nora had been to Sunday dinners there for 3 years, and she had never once been asked to sit at the good end of the table. It was not an accident. She understood that now in a way she had not let herself understand before. The Sunday before Thanksgiving, Camille held her usual dinner for 12. She seated Nora at the far end, between an aunt who was hard of hearing and an empty chair where someone had dropped out. Across the table, Audra Layton, whose father Camille had apparently decided was now a close enough friend to be included in family dinners, sat at Camille's right hand, laughing at the right moments and asking the right questions in the right voice. James's sister Blythe watched Audra the way people watch someone who has already been quietly approved. No one introduced Nora to the 2 guests she didn't recognize. Camille served everyone else before remembering to pass the swing dish in Nora's direction, and by then it was only a little warm. The only person who looked at Nora with any genuine warmth was James's uncle, Dean Bryne, a quiet man in his late 60s who had been a civil engineer for 30 years and had the particular steadiness of someone who had built real things and knew the difference between them and performance. He sat down the table from her and said her name correctly, the way he always did, and asked about an appraisal job she had mentioned 2 months ago because he had actually remembered she mentioned it. She told him it had gone well. He said he was glad to hear it. Camille had known about Nora for 2 years and 3 months. It had started simply enough. A background check she had run on every woman James dated, which was her habit and her right, she had decided. The results on Nora Whitfield had come back with a flag she had not expected. The PII she used had been thorough. Elliott Whitfield, Whitfield Capital Group, a private equity and real estate holding company with consolidated assets just over $1, or $4 billion, 1 heir, 1 controlling trustee. A woman who worked as a freelance antique appraiser and drove a 6-year-old car and bought her coffee from a half-empty corner shop. Camille had sat with that report for 3 days. If she told James and he stayed married to Nora, which she would, because James would absolutely stay married to $1. $4 billion, then Nora would have leverage Camille could not manage. The family would shift toward Nora. Nora would stop being the quiet woman at the wrong end of the table and start being the person in the room everyone needed. Camille would lose the position she had spent decades cultivating. There was another option. She called Douglas Layton on a Thursday afternoon. She had met Douglas twice at charity events and knew him by reputation, ambitious, practical, and currently trying to expand his hospitality portfolio into the Buckhead corridor, which, as it happened, was exactly where Whitfield Capital's 3 problematic properties sat. They met for lunch. She laid it out plainly. James's marriage was not going to last. She could manage that. Once it was over, Nora would need to liquidate. She would be isolated, disconnected from whatever social capital the Bryne name had given her, grieving the end of what she had believed was a permanent life. In that state, a reasonable offer on the Whitfield properties would look attractive. "And my daughter," Douglas had asked, "is exactly what James needs," Camille had said. It was not a villainous conversation. That was what made it so effective. It was simply 2 people solving an obstacle with the tools they had available. Now, at the Sunday dinner table, Nora watched Camille and Audra and understood for the first time that the discomfort she had always felt in this house was not her imagination or her own insecurity. It had been designed. Every slight, every omission, every moment of being seated wrong or served last or forgotten in an introduction, it had all been intentional, patient, and coordinated. The understanding settled into her very quietly. After dinner, Camille pulled James into the kitchen. Nora was standing near the hallway and heard them through the door. "I think it's time you were honest with yourself about where you want this marriage to go," Camille said. Her voice was low and kind in the specific way it became when she was managing something. A long pause. "I'm focused on Summit Row right now," James said. "Of course you are." Camille's voice didn't change. "I just want you to be happy, James. That's all I've ever wanted." Nora walked to the coat closet and retrieved her jacket. Dean found her there. He put a hand briefly on her shoulder as he passed and didn't say anything. It was the kind of comfort that knows better than to announce itself. On the drive home, James was quiet. She didn't push him. She thought instead about Tuesday at 2, about Aaron's conference room on the 41st floor, about the question she needed to ask him, and the answer she already suspected she knew. Aaron Park's office on the 41st floor had a view of Buckhead that on a clear afternoon showed you exactly why people wanted to build there. The light came in at an angle that made everything look valuable. Nora had always thought it was probably not an accident that real estate attorneys chose offices with views like this. She sat across from Aaron and told him what she had observed: the dinner, the Whitfield name in James's mouth, Audra's comment about pressure points. She was methodical about it. Aaron was quiet the whole time she spoke, the way he became. When he was absorbing something, he would need to think about carefully. When she finished, he said, "The negotiation has been ongoing for 18 months. Crane Belmont Partners filed their initial development rights inquiry with the trust management layer in February of last year. Every request has been handled by the advisory team per your instructions to hold." He paused. "They have been asking for a meeting with whoever holds trustee authority. That request has been declined 18 times. Nora looked at him. "James doesn't know the trust is mine. He has never been told. The management layer has no obligation to disclose trustee identity in these proceedings. And if he had ever asked me about my work, he would have learned your maiden name," Aaron said, "which he has apparently never looked up." She was quiet for a moment. "What does Crane Belmont need specifically?" Aaron set a folder on the table. "Development easements on 3 parcels, 2 commercial, 1 mixed use. Without those easements, Summit Row cannot break ground. They have financing conditional on closing these rights by Q1 next year. If that deadline passes, the anchor investment pulls out." Nora looked at the folder without opening it. She already knew what was inside. She had reviewed the Whitfield Buckhead holdings when she first took on the trust. 3 properties that her father had maintained specifically as long-term holds. Not because they were the most immediately profitable, but because he had understood that land in a corridor like Buckhead only ever became more valuable, and because he had learned to think in decades. "I want everything held at the current status," she said. "No communication, no meetings, no movement. And I want you to stop any disclosure of trustee identity regardless of what pressure they apply." Aaron made a note. For how long she thought about it. "I'll tell you when." He looked at her over the rims of his glasses. He had the quality of a man who understood exactly what she was doing and had decided it was her right to do it. He nodded once. She was in the parking garage when Dean called. He had never called her at an unusual time before, and she picked up immediately. He was not calling about anything dramatic. He had been visiting James and had stopped at a coffee shop afterward and was just checking in. He mentioned carefully, in the way that people mention things they are not sure they should mention, that he had seen James and Audra together at a restaurant near Perimeter last Tuesday, and then again on Thursday at the lunch spot near his office. "I'm not telling you what to do with that," Dean said. "I just thought you should know." "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate it." She drove home and parked and sat in the car for a while. She was not surprised. That was the thing she kept coming back to. She was not surprised, and the fact that she was not surprised was its own kind of information. At some point in the last 6 months, she had stopped expecting James to choose her. She had just been waiting to understand the shape of what she was choosing instead. That evening, she found the map. James had left his work bag on the kitchen counter, the wide canvas bag he carried, when he was commuting between the office and site visits. She had moved it to make room for the grocery bags, and when she picked it up, the zipper came open and a folded paper slid out. She picked it up automatically, or opened it without thinking. It was a printed aerial map of the Buckhead Development Corridor, about 2 feet wide when unfolded. Summit Row was outlined in blue. 3 parcels sat at the center of the proposed site, or outlined in red marker with the notation WCG Holdings. Beside each WCG Whitfield Capital Group, she looked at the map for a long time. 3 parcels her father had held for 30 years, outlined in red by her husband, who had never once asked about her family name. She took out her phone and photographed the map. She sent it to Aaron with 3 words, "When I say." He replied in 30 seconds. "Understood. I'll be ready." She refolded the map exactly as she had found it and put it back in the bag. She made dinner. She set the table. When James came in from the back door, she asked how his day had been. He said busy. He said Summit Row was getting complicated. He said he thought there might finally be a way through. Good, she said. And she meant it to be one thing, but by then she knew it had become another. Camille called James on a Thursday morning in mid-December to tell him about her Christmas plans. Nora was in the kitchen when the call came in, and she heard enough of it through the open door to understand what was being arranged. The words "just the immediate family" reached her clearly. She heard James say, of course, in the voice he used when he was agreeing to something he planned to explain to her later, as if it were fine. He told her that evening. He was very calm about it. His mother was doing something smaller this year, just the family, and he thought it would be better if Nora had a quiet Christmas. She had been working hard. She might enjoy some time to herself. Nora looked at him for a moment. She said, "It was not a question." James paused. "She's become close with my mother. It's a family thing." "Audra's not your family," Nora said. "Nora, I'm your wife, James." He had no response that worked, and he knew it. So he said something about how it wasn't meant the way it seemed, and he would make it up to her, and this was just one Christmas. And they could do something nice together on the actual day. His voice stayed reasonable throughout. It was the version of him she had come to recognize as the one that had already made the decision and was now managing the announcement. She did not argue further. She went to bed. He stayed in the living room. Christmas Eve she spent at Aaron's office. He had not expected her, and he had not asked what brought her in on December 24th. But he had cleared the afternoon without comment and made coffee, and let her sit across from him, with the trust documents spread between them for the better part of 3 hours. They went through the Buckhead properties in detail. Aaron walked her through what a trustee-consented easement would require, what the timeline would look like, what documentation Crane Belmont would need to see, and at what point in the process she would have to appear in person. By the time they finished, it was dark. She thanked him. He told her she was very well prepared. She said her father had been very thorough. On the drive home, she saw the notification come in, a photo from James's sister Blythe, posted publicly to her social media. The Brine family Christmas, long table candles, Camille at the head, James on one side, Audra on the other in the chair Nora had occupied for 3 years. Audra's hand was on the table near James's arm. It was a very natural placement, the kind that comes from practice. Nora set her phone face down on the passenger seat. She drove home. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands around the mug and looked at the December dark outside the window. She was not angry. What she felt was something quieter and more specific, the particular clarity of someone who has waited long enough to be certain about what they are seeing. James came home at 11:15. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her sitting there. "I'm sorry about tonight," he said. "No," she said, "you're not. But it's all right." He came and sat across from her. He looked tired in the way people look tired when they've been performing all evening. "I don't know what you want from me anymore," he said. She looked at him. James Brine, whom she had loved for 4 years, who had asked about her grandmother's house full of old things on the night they met, who had held her when her father died, who had never once asked why the Whitfield name was on her driver's license. "You never asked," she said. He didn't understand. She could see him trying to work out if this was about the Christmas dinner or something larger. He had lost the ability to tell the difference, which was its own kind of answer. She went to bed. He sat in the kitchen for a while. The next morning was very quiet. She made coffee and left a cup for him. She showered and dressed, and then she sat at the desk in the spare room and called Dean. He answered on the second ring. I need to tell you something, she said, before it happens in a room full of people. A long pause. She could hear him breathing. All right, he said finally. Come over. She drove to his apartment on the west side. He met her at the door and didn't ask any questions. He made coffee and sat across from her and waited. She told him everything. About Whitfield Capital, about her father's trust, about the Buckhead properties and the 18 months of blocked negotiations and the map in James's work bag. She told him about Audra and Douglas Layton and what she had begun to understand about how it all connected. Dean was quiet for a long time after she finished. Does James know any of this? He said. No. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. I've been watching Camille manage that boy since he was in his 20s, he said. I never understood what she was managing him toward. He looked at Nora. Now I do. He reached across the table and put his hand briefly over hers. What are you going to do? She looked at him. I'm going to let them finish showing me who they are, she said, and then I'm going to show them who I am. 3 days after Christmas, Dean went to Camille's house to help clear the dining room. She had asked him to bring his truck. She was donating several pieces of furniture before the new year, and she needed a hand moving them. He had done this for her before. He was the kind of family member who showed up for practical tasks without being asked twice. Camille was out at a lunch she had mentioned offhandedly. She had told him to let himself in and start in the dining room. He had her spare key. He had always had her spare key. He worked through the dining room in about 40 minutes, 3 chairs, a side table, an ornamental cabinet that turned out to be heavier than it looked. He moved everything to the front hall. Then he went looking for the room Camille had mentioned, storing the furniture pads she used for transport, or which she had told him was in the study. The study door was open. He found the furniture pads in the closet and was on his way back out when he bumped the corner of the desk and the drawer that had been closed, or he had thought it was closed, rolled 2 inches open. He caught it automatically, and he saw what was inside. He stood there for a moment. Then he pulled the drawer the rest of the way open. There were 2 folders. The first was thick, held together with a rubber band, a printed report with a cover page that read background investigation. Nora Whitfield and a date from 2 years and 4 months ago. He opened it. The first page laid out the basics in the flat language of professional investigation: name, age, education, employment history. The second page was the one that stopped him. Asset profile, Whitfield Family Trust. Beneficiary and controlling trustee, Nora Whitfield. Her current estimated total trust assets, 1. The second folder was thinner. It was a printed email chain. The most recent email at the top was from Camille to a contact listed as D. Layton. He read the thread from the bottom up, the way you read a record to understand how something developed. It took him 11 minutes to read it twice. He was a careful man. He wanted to be certain he understood what he was reading before he decided what it meant. He understood it. He photographed every page with his phone. Then he put the folders back exactly as he had found them, closed the drawer, and walked out of the study with the furniture pads under his arm. He loaded the furniture into his truck. He left a note on the kitchen counter saying everything was in the front hall ready for the donation center, and he'd had another appointment come up. He drove directly to Nora's house. She answered the door in a work apron. She had been photographing a set of porcelain pieces for a client. She took one look at his face and stood back to let him in. He sat at her kitchen table. He showed her the photographs. She read through them without any expression he could read. She was very still. He watched her go from the first email to the last, and then she set his phone down, and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. How long have you known she was capable of this? She said. He exhaled slowly. I didn't know this specifically. He met her eyes. I knew something was wrong. With how she talked about you. With how James changed after she started spending more time with the Layton people. I suspected she was managing something. I didn't think it was this. His hands weren't quite steady. I should have looked sooner. I should have been less willing to assume the best. She put her hand over his. You came when it counted, she said. He looked at her. He was 68 years old, and he had seen his family do small cruelties to people who didn't deserve them for 30 years, and he had never been able to figure out what to do about it, except show up quietly, and push the dinner roll to the right person. What are you going to do with this? He said. I'm going to use it, she said carefully, and at the right moment, she called Aaron Park. He picked up in 2 rings. She said. Crane Belmont is hosting their year-end dinner on New Year's Eve, the Aaron said. He sounded unsurprised. I saw the event filing. The venue, she said. A brief pause. Whitfield Buckhead Hotel, the banquet suite on the 3rd floor. Another pause. Which is a Whitfield Capital property, as you know. I know. She was quiet for a moment. I want to be in the room, and I need you there, with the trust documents, the PI report, and the full email chain. Nora. His voice was measured. If you do this in that room with those people present, it will be irrevocable. I know, she said again. He was quiet for several seconds. Then, I'll have everything ready. What time do you want me there? 6:30. An hour before the dinner starts. She ended the call. Dean was still sitting at her table, watching her. Will you come? She said. I don't need you to do anything. I just want one person in the room who chose a side before it was obvious. Dean looked at her for a long moment. He thought about all the Sunday dinners he had sat through, all the role pushing, all the careful looking away. I'll be there, he said. New Year's Eve was gray and cold, the kind of Atlanta cold that doesn't commit to itself the way northern cold does, but gets into the joints quietly and stays there. Nora drove to the Whitfield Buckhead Hotel at 4:30, 2 hours before she was supposed to be anywhere. She used the side entrance. She had the key card. She had always had the key card. One of 3 that Aaron kept in a fireproof case for precisely the kind of thing she had never expected to need. The hotel had been built in 1971 by her grandfather and renovated twice under her father's direction. She had walked through it as a girl. The carpet in the executive corridor was the same shade of deep green it had always been, because her father had believed that some things should not be changed simply because you could. She went to the administrative suite on the 2nd floor. Aaron was already there. He had arranged everything on the conference table, the trust documents in a bound folio, the PI report with relevant pages flagged, the email chain printed on clean paper in the order a reader would need to understand what they were looking at. Beside these, a notarized certificate of trustee identity. They went through the plan once. It was short. She had learned from her father that plans you need to explain twice are plans that will fall apart at the wrong moment. Aaron knew his role, she knew hers. Afterward, she sat alone in the suite for a while. She thought about the conversation she would not have. She had considered many times whether she should tell James before tonight. Give him a private version of this, somewhere quiet, where he might be able to respond without an audience watching him understand what he had done. She had decided, finally, that the answer was no, not because she wanted the audience, but because James had had 4 years of quiet conversations. He had had 4 years of moments that could have been the moment he asked the right question, and none of them had been. A private conversation would have let him manage his reaction. It would have let him find a frame for it that protected him from the full weight of what he had chosen not to see. Tonight would not allow that. She wrote a letter. It took 3 drafts. It was not long, just 6 sentences, saying the things she had not been able to say in 4 years of a marriage that had been mostly real, and then, more recently, mostly managed. She sealed it and gave it to Aaron. Not tonight, she said, after. He nodded and put it in his jacket pocket. She dressed in the suite. She had brought what she needed in a garment bag. Because she had learned from the women in her family that there is a particular confidence that comes from having prepared your own ground. She wore dark blue, a color she had always been told was too plain for a night like this. She liked it because it was hers. She wore the earrings her father had given her when she was accepted into the appraiser certification program, which he had attended the ceremony for, with a pride completely out of proportion to what most people would have considered a modest professional achievement. She looked at herself in the mirror of the administrative suite for a moment. She thought about her father saying, "They will show you who they are. Wait for that, and then you'll know what you're deciding." She had waited. She had the whole picture now. She took the elevator down. In the lobby, she passed the front desk, and a junior associate named Priya, who had been with the hotel for about 8 months, looked up from her screen and said, "Miss Whitfield," and then caught herself. Nora stopped. Priya looked. "I'm so sorry. I know you said you preferred." "It's all right," Nora said. She gave her a small smile. "Miss Brine tonight. 1 more hour. Priya nodded quickly and looked back at her screen. Nora crossed the lobby toward the banquet hall corridor. Through the closed double doors, she could hear the event, glasses, conversation, a kind of ambient energy that came from rooms full of people who believed they were on the verge of something large. She had been in enough rooms like that to know what they sounded like. She stopped outside the doors. She could hear James. He was speaking. The event was apparently between courses, and he was standing somewhere in the room making the kind of toast that established what kind of man he was to people who hadn't yet had to test it. He was talking about Summit Row, about what it would mean for the firm, about the team he had around him, about the year ahead. She listened to him for a moment. He was good at it. That had always been true. He could hold a room. He had a voice that made people want to believe what he was saying. If things had gone differently, if she had told him 4 years ago, if he had stayed the person she married, if Camille had not spent 2 years quietly rerouting his life, she would have been proud to hear that voice in a room like this. She put her hand on the door. She pushed it open. The room did not stop. But James saw her. She watched it move across his face, surprise, then confusion, then something that was trying to arrange itself into calm. "Nora, I didn't know you were. I know you didn't," she said. Her voice was level and clear in the room that had just gotten a little quieter. "That's why I'm here." The room held about 30 people. Crane Belmont's senior partners, development investors, the latent contingent on one side, a handful of lawyers and consultants. Camille was there, seated near the head of the table in the chair Nora recognized as the one reserved for honored guests. She had positioned herself as a supportive presence at her son's milestone evening. She was wearing the earrings she always wore when she was feeling certain about something. Audra was at James's right. Her posture changed when Nora walked in. A small adjustment, barely visible, the kind the body makes when it recalculates a situation. Nora walked to the edge of the room. She did not take a seat. She looked at James and waited. He had been mid-toast when she entered. He recovered more quickly than she had expected. He looked at her with an expression she recognized, the one that meant he was managing her presence in real time, deciding how to absorb it into whatever narrative he had been constructing. "I was actually just about to say something," James said, and there was a shade of warning in his voice for her, just underneath the warmth he was performing for the room. "Something I should have shared with the team already." He set down his glass. "Nora and I are separating. It's mutual, it's amicable, and it has no impact on anything we're building here." He gave the room a smile that meant, "This is handled, move on now." On to Summit Row, Aaron Park stood. He was not tall, and he was not loud, but he had the quality that good attorneys develop over decades of practice, the ability to command attention simply by deciding to take up space. He had entered through the side door 30 seconds after Nora, and no one had registered him until now. "I apologize for the interruption," Aaron said. "I represent the Whitfield Family Trust. I have documentation that is directly relevant to the Summit Row transaction, and I would ask 5 minutes of the room's time." The silence was immediate. "James, this isn't 5 minutes," Aaron said. "Not a request." He set the bound folio on the table and opened it. He walked through the Whitfield family trust structure in the precise, unhurried way of someone who has explained complicated things to important rooms many times and is not afraid of the time it takes. 3 Buckhead parcels, current assessed value, development easement requirements, and the identity of the controlling trustee without whose written consent no transaction affecting any Whitfield capital property could be executed, financed, or transferred. He said Nora's name. Her full name, Nora Whitfield Brine. He said her title. Sole controlling trustee of the Whitfield Family Trust, Whitfield Capital Group. He set the notarized certificate of trustee identity on the table where the people across from him could read it. Douglas Layton's attorney leaned forward and read it. Then he leaned back and looked at the ceiling. Douglas himself sat very still with his hands folded in front of him. Audra set down her glass. James stared at Nora. She met his eyes and let him look. Aaron then took out the second set of documents. He explained them in the same calm, measured voice. A private investigation report, commissioned by a member of the Brine family, identifying Nora Whitfield as the Whitfield heir approximately 2 years and 4 months ago. And an email correspondence. produced under separate documentation between that family member and a latent family business representative, outlining a strategy to use the Brine marriage as a vehicle to eventually access and acquire the Whitfield properties at a reduced valuation following divorce. He set both documents on the table and stepped back. Camille's face did something that Nora watched carefully. It moved through denial, calculation, and arrival at a specific kind of stillness that was its own kind of confession. Her earrings caught the light. No one spoke for several seconds, the kind of silence that a room arrives at when there is nothing left to manage. James turned to his mother. She had nothing. For the first time in the 30-some years Nora had heard James describe her, Camille Brine had no sentence available. She opened her mouth once and closed it. Dean stood near the wall. He was the only Brine in the room who met Nora's eyes without shame. James looked at Nora. His face had gone past her surprise into something she didn't have a word for. Not grief exactly, but the specific expression of someone who has just understood the dimensions of something they built and found it smaller than they thought, and older, and already crumbling. "You never once asked me about my work," Nora said. "Not once, in 4 years." She said it plainly, not as an accusation, but as a fact. "You knew my name. You said it every day. You just never looked it up." He had no response. "I am the Whitfield heir," she said. "I have been since the day we met, and none of you thought to look." She turned to Aaron. "We're done here." She walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard the room begin its own reckoning. The particular murmur of people recalibrating what they had just understood. She heard Audra say something to Douglas in a low voice. She heard a chair scrape, and then she heard Camille's voice, composed again now that she had found it, aimed at her retreating back. "You should have told him years ago." Nora stopped, turned. She looked at Camille Brine for what she knew would be the last time, the careful composure, the earrings, the woman who had made a decision 2 years ago in a room alone and had been executing it ever since. "So should you," Nora said. She walked out. She left the door open behind her. The January cold came in from the corridor. Summit Row did not close. The anchor investor withdrew within 48 hours. The conditional financing expired. Crane Belmont Partners announced internally that the Buckhead development had been suspended pending a review of its contractual framework, which was the language companies use when something has gone wrong in a way they prefer not to describe. James's name was quietly removed from the Summit Row team. By February, he was managing a smaller portfolio in a smaller office, which was its own kind of answer about how the firm understood what had happened. Douglas Layton said nothing publicly. His people said nothing. There was very little that could be said. The email chain existed. Aaron had copies. Douglas was a practical man, and he understood the arithmetic of a situation in which the documentation was thorough, and the other party had nothing to gain from a settlement. Audra Layton moved on. It did not take long. Camille Brine, standing in the circles that had always sustained her, shifted in ways that were quiet and permanent. Atlanta's social world is not large, and its memory is long, and the people who matter in it had read the same documents that had been in that banquet room. No one said anything direct. They simply became harder to reach. The divorce was handled by Aaron, efficiently. The settlement was simple. Nora had entered the marriage with considerably more than she was leaving it with, and she did not seek anything else. She kept her antique appraisal business, which she had built herself, and which had never belonged to anyone but her. She kept the apartment she had moved into after the house became only technically a home. She kept Aaron on retainer and expanded the Whitfield Trust's community reinvestment portfolio, specifically a series of neighborhood preservation grants in the Buckhead corridor that had been in development for 2 years, and that she now had the time to execute properly. Dean came for dinner on Sundays when he felt like it, which was most weeks. He did not offer explanations or apologies beyond the one he had already made. He showed up. That was the form his amendment took, and she respected it. James called once, 6 months after the divorce was finalized. She agreed to meet him for coffee, 15 minutes, a place near her office, a Tuesday morning. He looked like himself mostly. He said he had been thinking about a lot of things. He asked if she had ever really loved him. She said yes. He looked at his coffee. "Then why didn't you fight for us?" She considered the question. She thought about the gallery opening where they met. The early apartment where he had kept the windows open, even in November, because he said he liked the sound of the city. The evening he had held her when her father died. All the small moments that had been real and that she had not fabricated in hindsight. Because that fight required you to see me, she said, and you didn't want to. You wanted to see a version of me that fit the life you were building. When I didn't fit it anymore, you stopped looking. She met his eyes. I can't want something for you more than you want it for yourself. He had no response to that. Not a bad one, not a deflecting one, just none. She thought it might be the most honest she had ever seen him. She shook his hand. She drove home. A year after the dinner at the Whitfield Buckhead Hotel, she was in Charleston closing a reinvestment transaction, a small historic building the trust was funding for preservation. The project manager, a woman named Ruth, who had been rehabbing old buildings for 25 years, took her on a walk-through after the papers were signed. The building had been a dry goods store once, then a law office, then empty for a decade. Now it would be something else again. Ruth talked about it the way people talk about things they genuinely love, carefully, with attention to detail. Nora found herself thinking about her grandmother's house in Virginia, all the drawers full of objects from different decades. Her father saying, every old thing has a story about who kept it and why. Back in her hotel room that evening, she unwrapped a small cloth bundle she had carried in her work bag for several months. Inside were 2 business cards. The first was her father's, Elliot Whitfield, Whitfield Capital Group, the font slightly worn at the edges from being handled, from being kept. The second was new, her name, her title. She set them both on the desk. She sat with them for a moment, not as symbols of victory, not as proof of anything, just as true things, simple and factual, the way her father had always wanted truth to be presented. No ceremony necessary. Then she opened her laptop and got to work. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read everyone. We'll see you in the next story.